The demise of the architect. To some extent, the death of the architect has already been announced. It was announced, for example, in this special issue of the Architect's Journal in the UK, where a group of architects who had been practicing under the name of FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, came back together in order to guest edit this issue of the Architect's Journal. Sean Griffith, Charles Holland, and Sam Jacob. And it should be pointed out that the Architect's Journal is the primary professional journal in the UK. It's not about progressive designs like Architectural Design and other such magazines. It's a magazine about the profession, and for the Architect's Journal to publish this is highly significant. And in this issue, and here they are in more detail, they're actually now teaching, some of them in the States and some of them back in the UK, and they've relinquished their practice. They did so 2 or 3 years before this was published, but they came back together for this special issue. And in this issue, I mean, they're known for their kind of slightly provocative and jocular views, very progressive group. They lay out their reasons why they think that the architect is dead. And according to Sean Griffith, I came to the conclusion that the profession in its current form will not survive, and that the successful architects of the future will not be architects at all. They will be engaged in a much wider range of activities, will be more entrepreneurial, and will operate outside of the profession. I think the key word there is entrepreneurial. It'll be really much more a business rather than necessarily a design consultancy. Architecture will be more about business matters. And Charles Holland, again, tongue-in-cheek, goes on to make these comments. Personally, I find it amazing how little anyone in Architecture Crit refers to actual architecture. Other projects, books, films, ideas, something you had for breakfast that morning, anything but boring old architecture. That is tongue-in-cheek, but you get what I mean. It's like architecture itself wasn't interesting enough to capture the imagination, and everything else was imported into the domain of the architect. Here I wanted to draw upon a distinction that Stanford Anderson, the one-time professor of history and architecture and history and theory at MIT, made between the discipline and the profession. I think this is very instructive. They are, in many ways, very different forms of operation. The discipline refers to the academic side of things, and the profession refers to the profession. Now, the discipline of architecture, in many ways, is thriving. What happens in schools of architecture is there's probably been no greater moment in terms of kind of creative exploration, experimentation in certain schools, such as SCIARC, such as the AA or the Bartlett and so on all around the world, than right now. The discipline of architecture is thriving. But the profession of architecture, which is constrained in many ways by the fact that it has to be paid for by the profits from designing a building, is struggling. I think there can be no other word for it. It is struggling. This in some way is reflected in this very clever title of a book by Marika Trotter and Esther Choi, Architecture is All Over. This is what the French would call a double entendre, a double meaning, because on the one hand, it's saying that architecture is all over, which is a suggestion maybe that architecture has come to an end, it is no more, it is dead, but also the fact that architecture is all over, architecture is everywhere. And that clearly refers to the discipline of architecture. And once you get to the point where there is no longer any category of architecture, then it disappears entirely. When architecture is everywhere, it is nowhere. When culture is everywhere, it is nowhere. When everything becomes art, the category of art itself disappears. This is in fact the thinking of the French cultural theorist Jean Baudrillard. When everything becomes one thing, then we lose our sense of what it is. When everything becomes architecture, architecture disappears. When architecture can embrace everything, then there's no longer any such sense that there is such thing as thing. There is no longer any sense that there is such a thing as architecture. Interestingly, the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, commissioned a study of the Building Futures Group, a kind of think tank that I was once a member of, where they observed, and in a way very honestly observed, that the profession was already in danger. Um, uh, uh, and the comment made on the cover of this, in 10 years we will not call ourselves an architectural practice, it will be something else entirely. And the comment made here is that actually architects had to diversify. They had to go into other related disciplines, industrial design, product design, and so on, in order to survive. The term architect was seemingly obsolete because it didn't describe the kind of activities, emerging activities, that were defining those who had graduated from within architecture. Now, of course, architecture has always already been in trouble. This is a figure, 5%, that is always bandied around, and I don't know where it comes from. Everyone just quotes it, and so at the point where it has been accepted. But only 5% of all buildings are designed by architects. Now, maybe in some cultures there are more, maybe some cultures less, but there is only an insignificant percentage of the overall number of buildings being built that are designed by architects. Architects have never been in charge of the design of buildings, unlike, say, lawyers or medics, who are largely in charge of their own discipline. And that has got worse. That has got worse. It's got worse because of a number of significant developments, not least the fact that the developer is often in charge now of the project. If in Alberti's day it was the architect who was in charge, and that's what the word architect meant, the chief builder, the guy in charge, if in Alberti's time it was the architect who was in charge of construction, now it is the developer, and the architect has lost all power. In this particular case, a design for a football stadium, a soccer stadium in Liverpool for the Everton Football Club, the architect was kicked off the job. And Demise, who designed it, was extremely disappointed, I think that's an understatement, at the fact that he had lost his project. And that's the point. That's the point. From being in a situation when the architect was fully in charge, now in the UK, and I don't know what the situation is in other countries, but more than 50% of all buildings are designed and built under a design-build contract with a developer. It is no longer the architect in charge. The architect in Alberti's time was the person for whom the hand of the labor of the worker was but an instrument, a kind of prosthetic device. The architect was in charge and the builder worked for the architect. Now the architect is working for the developer. And also those organizations trying to protect, and doing such a poor job, it has to be said, trying to protect the profession of architecture, have resorted to kind of squabbling. Then the famous case of the Shard in London, seen here in this somewhat exaggerated perspective because the building is not that tall, designed by Renzo Piano. There was a moment when one of the organizations in the UK pronounced that Renzo Piano could not be called an architect in the UK because he hadn't qualified in the UK. Now, how absurd can you get? And we have the same situation in the States, where you can only practice in an individual state where you're qualified, despite the fact that architecture as a profession has become completely international. In other words, those organizations that validate architecture, that in some senses control architecture, have failed to keep pace with the times, and they certainly have failed to protect architects. If I were to point to the one book I could find about the future of architecture, it would be this, by Mark Kushner, the future of architecture in 100 buildings. And what is so worrying about this approach is that it's operating completely at an aesthetic realm. What are the kind of design ideas that are going to be influential in the future? Ignoring the fact there are any number of issues on the horizon to do the introduction of new technologies, to do changes in the way that the building industry operates, which are dictating how the future of architecture might go. The worrying aspect about this is that to some extent, architects should be thinking about the future. Every design, every building that they do potentially could be constructed in the future. It is a profession premised on the future. But do we see any discussion about the future of architecture in any school of architecture? Not many. Most are dominated by a discourse of history. Now, I have nothing wrong with history. I see nothing wrong with history, but history is connected also to the future. The past and the future are indissolubly connected in some way. As the famous expression goes, in 2 days' time, tomorrow will be yesterday. In 2 days' time, tomorrow will be yesterday. And we as architects, who should be thinking, should be planning, because that's what we do for the future, have singularly failed to address that. And what is my view of architects? Architects, to my mind, are sleepwalking into oblivion. They are like ostriches who've stuck their head in the sand and are being oblivious to the conditions in which our own profession is being undermined and taken away from us. Architects are like ostriches.